Victoria Whitfield ordered security to seize his toolbox on Tuesday morning. She didn't know that Elias Vance had already been inside the building since 4:30, or that the desk drawer in the small office had stuck on the third pole for 38 years. She saw a mechanic with grease under his fingernails and a child drawing at a table in the corner. What she didn't see was the agreement her father had made in 1987, witnessed by two men now dead, stored in a place she didn't know existed. What her father had placed in that drawer wasn't a way to win in court. It was the reason the entire room would go silent before the afternoon ended. Elias Vance woke at 4:15 without an alarm. He hadn't used one in 14 years, not since Maddie was born, and his body learned to anticipate her first cry before his mind had fully surfaced from sleep. He moved through his apartment in the dark, a two-bedroom unit on the second floor of the converted industrial building on Mercer Street, and he dressed in the same order he always did. He put on his socks first, then his work pants, then the flannel shirt with the left elbow worn soft from leaning against the same workbench for 38 years. The building woke slowly around him. At 5 o'clock, the old boiler kicked in with a sound like a deep breath, drawn and held. At 5:15, the streetlights outside the high windows began to fade against the gray February sky. By 5:30, Elias was downstairs in the workshop, the overhead fluorescents humming their particular note, the air carrying the familiar mixture of machine oil, metal shavings, and the faint sulfur trace of the gas line he had rerouted himself in 1999. He wasn't an employee of Whitfield Properties, and he hadn't been one since the week he arrived in 1987. He was a tenant taker, which meant he paid no rent and received no paycheck. In exchange, he kept the building standing. He serviced the boiler before it failed, patched the roof before it leaked, maintained the loading dock leveler that freight companies use twice a week, and reset the electrical breakers that the old wiring threw every time the weather turned cold. The building had been scheduled for demolition 3 times before Arthur Whitfield bought it, and it would have returned to that condition within 18 months if Elias had stopped coming. The workshop occupied the ground floor, a single open space with 14-foot ceilings and concrete floors that had been poured in 1952 and had developed a network of hairline cracks that Elias monitored the way a doctor monitors a patient's pulse. He knew which cracks were new and which had been there since the 1980 seconds. He knew that the crack near the northeast column widened by approximately 1 millimeter every winter, and he knew that the steel plate he had welded across it in 2003 was still holding. They were simply the facts of the place, and Elias treated facts with the respect they deserved. His toolbox sat against the south wall, a 1963 snap-on chest in battleship gray that he had bought used from a retiring aviation mechanic in 1985. It had 3 main drawers, and each one opened with a resistance that Elias could have diagnosed blindfolded. The top drawer held the hand tools. The middle drawer held the sockets and drivers, arranged by size in a sequence that Maddie had memorized by the time she was 6. The bottom drawer held the heavy equipment, the torque wrenches, and the pry bars and the diagnostic meters that Elias had accumulated across 4 decades. Nothing in that chest was decorative. Every tool wore the specific wear pattern of a specific bolt on a specific machine, and losing any one of them would have been like losing a finger. Maddie was 8 now, and on school mornings, she came down to the workshop at 6:45. With her backpack already zipped and her hair still tangled from sleep, she didn't play in the workshop. She sat at a small table in the corner that Elias had built from scrap maple in 2019. She drew pictures while he worked. She knew the sound of every tool returning to its place, and she knew that if the drawer didn't close with the right weight, something was missing. She had never asked why he checked the roof drains in the specific order that he did, or why he listened to the boiler for 30 seconds before touching any valve. He simply knew that he did, and that the building stayed standing because of it. That was the life they had built, and it wasn't large or complicated. But it was theirs, and it had been theirs for longer than most marriages lasted, longer than most businesses survived, and longer than the man who had made it possible had been alive to see it continue. In 1987, Elias Vance was 22 years old and recently discharged from the Navy, where he had spent 3 years working in the machine shop of a destroyer escort based out of Norfolk. He had no degree, no family in the city, and no plan beyond the certainty that he could fix anything that moved and several things that did not. He washed up at a diner on Halsted Street one afternoon in March, eating eggs he could barely afford, when he overheard the owner complaining to a waitress that the ice machine had been down for 2 days, and the repair company was talking about replacement parts that would cost more than the machine was worth. Elias didn't interrupt. He finished his eggs, paid with the last $3 in his pocket, and walked to the counter. He asked the owner if he could look at the machine. The owner, a man named DeLuca, who had spent 30 years learning not to trust strangers, said yes, mostly because he had nothing to lose. Elias opened the panel, checked the thermal fuse with a meter he carried in a canvas bag, and found the problem in 14 minutes. The fuse was testing clean at room temperature and failing only when the compressor engaged and the heat load increased. It was a 22-cent part, and Elias had a spare in his bag. Arthur Whitfield was sitting 3 booths away, eating a late lunch and reading a property report he wasn't enjoying. He had just purchased the building on Mercer Street, and every contractor he had brought through it had delivered the same verdict. The roof was failing, the electrical was pre-code, the boiler was original to the 1,950 seconds installation, and the concrete was showing stress patterns that suggested foundation settlement. The quotes ran between $80,000 and $120,000, which was more than Arthur had paid for the building itself. Every man who walked through had recommended demolition and new construction. Arthur watched Elias close the ice machine panel, wipe his hands on a rag from his back pocket, and explain to DeLuca that the fuse would hold for now, but the compressor was running 20% harder than it should, which meant it had maybe 18 months left before the bearings went. DeLuca offered to pay him. Elias shook his head and said he had already eaten. Then he walked out into the March wind without a coat. Arthur followed him. He caught Elias at the corner and asked if he knew anything about industrial boilers and 3-phase electrical. Elias said he did. Arthur asked if he wanted a job. Elias said he didn't want a job, but he would look at the building if Arthur wanted an honest assessment. They walked the 6 blocks together, and Arthur watched Elias move through the Mercer Street property the way a doctor moves through an emergency room. He didn't look at what was visible. He looked at what the dimensions and the stress marks and the rust patterns meant. Elias found the boiler problem in 11 minutes. It wasn't the boiler. It was the circulation pump, which was starving the system and causing the boiler to fire harder than necessary to compensate. The electrical was older than code, but structurally sound, provided that the load was balanced correctly, which it currently was not. The roof needed patching, not replacement. The concrete was talking, but it wasn't ready to fall. Arthur Whitfield made his offer standing in the center of that empty workshop. There would be no rent and no paycheck. Just keep the building alive, and the space is yours for as long as you want it. They shook hands. Arthur found 2 men to witness it, a freight driver named Morris and a postal worker named Chen, both of whom were dead now. Arthur wrote the terms on a sheet of notebook paper from his briefcase, and all 4 men signed it. Before Elias left that evening, Arthur took him into the small office and opened the bottom drawer of the metal desk. It stuck on the 3rd pull, and Arthur laughed and said it had always done that. He placed the folded paper inside and said, "If I'm not here, my daughter might not understand what you are. Show her the paper. She'll need to see it." Arthur Whitfield died in January of the previous year. The desk drawer still stuck on the 3rd pull. Victoria Whitfield was 34 years old, 3 years out of an MBA program she had attended at night while working full-time in her father's property management office. She had been appointed CEO of Whitfield Properties 6 months after Arthur's death, a transition that the board had approved unanimously because she was Arthur's daughter and because she had spent 15 years learning the business from the ground up. What she hadn't spent was a single afternoon in the workshop on Mercer Street. She arrived on a Thursday in late February with 2 assistants and a leather binder organized by color-coded tabs. The car was black, and it pulled into the loading zone that Elias had kept clear for freight deliveries. Victoria stepped out, wearing a charcoal coat and shoes that clicked against the concrete in a way that made Maddie look up from her drawing, without knowing why. Elias was checking the pressure gauge on the boiler when he heard the car. He wiped his hands on the rag he kept in his back pocket and walked to the front of the workshop. Victoria was already inside, moving through the space with the expression of someone touring a problem that had been described to her in a report, but that she hadn't yet learned to smell. She noted the 14-foot ceilings, the cracked concrete, the fluorescent lights that hummed at a frequency she found irritating, and the toolbox against the south wall that looked like something from a different century. She didn't see the steel plate welded across the northeast column crack. She didn't see the rerouted gas line that Elias had documented in a diagram he kept in the desk drawer. She didn't see the maintenance log that recorded every repair, every replacement, every adjustment he had made across 38 years of mornings. She saw an industrial space with low ceilings by modern standards, outdated systems, and a tenant who appeared to be using it for personal storage. Elias introduced himself. He didn't extend his hand, because it was still carrying grease from the boiler valve, and he had learned long ago that people who wore charcoal coats didn't appreciate grease on their palms. Victoria nodded and asked if he was the maintenance man. Elias told her he was the caretaker. Victoria looked past him to the small table in the corner, where Maddie sat with her crayons and her notebook. Victoria asked if the child was visiting. Elias answered that she lived here. Victoria's expression didn't change, but her assistant made a note. She opened her binder to a tab labeled Mercer Street Resining. The building was being converted to a logistics hub, she explained, and the workshop was non-conforming under the new zoning code. The space would need to be cleared, the equipment removed, and the tenant given 30 days to vacate. She used the word tenant in a way that suggested she didn't fully understand what the word meant in this particular case. Elias listened without interrupting. When she finished, he asked one question. He asked if her father had told her about the arrangement. Victoria closed her binder and said, "My father is dead. I make the decisions now." Maddie's crayon stopped moving in the middle of a line. The boiler ticked as it cooled. Elias nodded once, the way a man nods when he has heard something he expected but had hoped not to hear, and he walked back to the pressure gauge without another word. 12 days later, Elias arrived at 5:15 with Maddie in tow. It was school vacation, and she had begged to come early instead of waiting for the usual 6:45 descent. Elias had agreed because the boiler had been running unevenly since the weekend, and he wanted to check the circulation pump before the freight trucks arrived at 8 o'clock. Key turned halfway and stopped. Elias tried again. The lock was new, a commercial cylinder with a faceplate that gleamed in the dim light of the street lamp. Beside it, a keypad glowed green, waiting for a code that Elias had never been given. Maddie looked up at him. She was wearing the purple coat he had bought her in November, the one with the zipper that stuck if you didn't align the teeth. Precisely, she asked if they could go home. Elias said no, not yet. He walked around the building with Maddie's hand in his, moving past the dumpster that the pickup service had failed to empty for 2 weeks, past the loading dock where the leveler sat in its neutral position, and around the corner to the service entrance that Elias had installed himself in 1994. He carried a separate key ring for this lock, a ring he had never shown to Victoria, because he had assumed that anyone who owned the building would know every door in it. The key turned. The door opened. Inside the workshop was exactly as he had left it the previous evening. The gray chest sat against the south wall with the middle drawer half open, where he had been searching for a 10mm socket. The boiler hummed its familiar note. Elias turned on the lights, opened the toolbox fully, found the socket, and began the morning's work. Victoria arrived at 9 o'clock with a security consultant she had hired to assess the property's vulnerabilities. She stepped out of her black car and saw the lights on inside the workshop. She walked to the front door and found it still locked, the keypad still glowing, the code still unchanged from the default the installer had programmed. She walked around the building and entered through the front door, which she believed was the only door, and found Elias kneeling beside the boiler with a wrench in his hand, and Maddie sitting at her table drawing what appeared to be a cat with wings. Victoria stopped. She looked at the locked front door behind her, then at Elias, then at the open chest with its contents visible. She asked how he had gotten inside. Elias told her he had a key. She asked why he had a key to a building she had just secured. Elias answered that he carried keys to every door in the building, and he had had them for 38 years. The security consultant shifted his weight. Victoria's face tightened in a way that had nothing to do with the temperature of the room. She told Elias that he was trespassing on private property. She told him that his presence was unauthorized. She told him that he had 30 days, and that the countdown had started 12 days ago, and that he was now 18 days from eviction. She asked if he understood. Elias told her he understood what she was telling him. He didn't tell her he agreed. He stood up from the boiler, replaced the wrench in the top drawer of the toolbox, and closed the drawer with a sound that Maddie recognized as the sound of completion. Then he asked Victoria if she had checked the boiler pressure that morning. She said she had not. He said that was why the building still needed him, and he went back to work. Victoria didn't call the police. She believed that police were for emergencies, and this wasn't an emergency. It was an obstacle. She would handle obstacles the way she had been trained to handle them. She would remove the variables. 17 days after the confrontation at the boiler, 3 security officers arrived at the Mercer Street building in matching jackets that said Apex Corporate Security on the back. They came in a white van that Elias didn't recognize, and they parked in the freight zone that Elias cleared every morning before the trucks arrived. With them was a man named Caldwell, Victoria's operations director, a man who had never set foot in the workshop, but who had prepared a statement he intended to read. Elias was rewiring the motor on the loading dock leveler when he heard the van. He looked up from the workbench and saw the 3 officers and Caldwell standing in a formation that suggested they had been briefed on the layout of the building, but not on the layout of the man who maintained it. Maddie was in the small office, organizing the fasteners that Elias kept in a coffee can on the windowsill. She wasn't visible from the main door. Caldwell stepped forward. He held a tablet in one hand and a printed document in the other. He read from the document in a voice that carried the particular flatness of language that had been approved by a legal department. Elias Vance, you're currently trespassing on private property owned by Whitfield Properties. Your personal effects, including any tools, equipment, or materials located on these premises, are subject to confiscation as property of the occupying company. You're hereby ordered to vacate the premises immediately and to surrender all items that are not your personal clothing. Elias set down the wire stripper he had been holding and looked at Caldwell, then at the 3 officers, then at the tablet that Caldwell wasn't showing him, and told them the toolbox was his. Caruso was the aviation mechanic from O'Hare who sold it to him in 1985. A man who had retired after 30 years of maintenance work and who understood what a toolbox meant to the person who had filled it. Elias had carried it to Norfolk, and he had carried it back, and he had carried it into this building on the day Arthur Whitfield offered him the space. It wasn't company property. It was his. Caldwell looked at his tablet, then back at Elias. He explained that possession on private property created a legal gray area, and that the company's position was that any tools used to perform maintenance on company assets over a sustained period could be considered company property under the doctrine of accession. He didn't appear to fully understand the doctrine he was citing, but he had memorized the words correctly. The officers stepped forward. They were large men, and they were trained to handle resistance. The first officer moved toward the toolbox. Elias stood up from the workbench. He didn't raise his voice. He told Maddie to stay where she was. She didn't answer, but he knew she had heard him because the sound of her sorting fasteners in the coffee can had stopped. Elias closed the drawer where the wire strippers lived. He walked to the toolbox and placed both hands on the lid. The officer stopped. There was something in Elias's posture that suggested this wasn't the first time he had had to hold his ground, and that the ground he was holding wasn't merely metal. The officer looked at Caldwell. Caldwell checked his tablet. The tablet didn't have a protocol for this. Victoria arrived 12 minutes later. She had been watching from her car, a black sedan, parked across the street where she could see the workshop windows but couldn't be seen from inside. She entered the building and found her security officer standing 2 feet from a gray metal toolbox with his hands at his sides, her operations director sweating under the fluorescent lights, and a single father with grease under his fingernails standing between her team and the chest as if it contained something she hadn't accounted for. In any of her projections, she made her decision quickly. She had been trained to make decisions quickly. She told the officer to take the box. She spoke the words clearly so everyone in the room could hear them. Take the box. If he interferes, detain him. The officer reached again. Elias didn't move his hands. He spoke for the first time in a voice loud enough for everyone present to hear, and loud enough, he hoped, for his daughter to hear from the office, where she waited behind a door that didn't fully close. Before you touch that box, you should know what your father signed, and you should hear what he said about you. The officer's hand stopped in midair. Caldwell's tablet slipped in his grip. Victoria Whitfield looked at Elias Vance with an expression that had shifted from certainty to something she didn't want to name. Victoria pauses. She looks at the security officer, then at Caldwell, then at the toolbox with Elias's hands still resting on the lid. She asks what he's talking about. Elias walks to the small office. The door doesn't fully close because the jamb has warped slightly since 1994, and he has never fixed it because the gap lets him hear Maddie when she's inside. Maddie is standing by the window, the coffee can of fasteners forgotten on the sill. She's holding a drawing she made that morning. It shows the toolbox with the words "Daddy's" written across the top in purple crayon, the same purple as her coat. Elias opens the bottom drawer of the desk. It sticks on the third pull, the way it has always stuck. Inside is a manila folder that has aged to the color of old newspaper. He removes the folder and walks back to the workshop. The 3 security officers are still standing near the toolbox. Caldwell has stepped back toward the wall. Victoria hasn't moved. Elias hands her the folder. She opens it. Inside is the sheet of notebook paper from 1987, yellowed at the edges, but the ink still dark. 2 signatures appear at the bottom. Morris and Chen signed it, both of them dead now. And at the top, her father's handwriting remains. The same handwriting she had seen on birthday cards, and on the deed to her first car, and on the letter he had left in his safe deposit box, that she had read 6 months ago and hadn't fully understood. The terms are simple. The contract grants lifetime occupancy and workshop use of the Mercer Street ground floor in exchange for building maintenance and systems preservation. It is irrevocable upon satisfactory performance and transferable to Elias's heirs. No expiration date exists in the document. No termination clause exists either. The language gives Whitfield Properties no right to seize tools, evict tenants, or rezone the building without Elias's consent. Victoria reads it twice, the second time slower. Her hands are not steady. She turns the page and finds a second sheet beneath the contract. It isn't paper. It's a cassette tape. A small rectangle of plastic with a label in her father's handwriting that reads, "For Victoria. Proctoria. Don't open until she tries to take the building from him." Elias doesn't touch the tape. He says, "Your father asked me to keep this until you needed it. I think this is the day," he meant. Victoria looks at the tape. She looks at the officers. She looks at Maddie, who has come out of the office and is standing in the doorway with her drawing in both hands. She asks if there's a tape player. Elias opens the bottom drawer of the toolbox and produces a small cassette recorder, the kind that was sold in electronic stores in the 1992. He has kept it in working order because he believes in maintaining things. Victoria takes the recorder. She sits down on the workbench stool, the same stool Elias has used for 38 years. She inserts the tape. She presses play. Arthur Whitfield's voice fills the workshop. It isn't the voice of a dying man. It's the voice of a man who knew exactly what he was doing and who had chosen his words with the same care he had used when he wrote the contract. Victoria. If you're hearing this, it means you have decided that efficiency matters more than the man who kept my building alive for half my life. You're wrong. Elias Vance isn't a tenant. He's the reason that building still stands. The contract is real, but more than that, my word is real, and my word to you right now is this. The measure of a person isn't what they accumulate, it's what they protect when no one is watching. I protected him. Now you will too. Or you will prove you're not the person I believed you could be. The tape ends, the recorder clicks, the workshop is silent, the boiler ticks as it cools, the fluorescent lights hum their particular note. Outside, a freight truck rumbles past on Mercer Street, unaware that a room has gone quiet in a way that no boardroom ever does. Victoria looks at the security officers. She looks at Caldwell. She looks at Maddie still holding the drawing. She looks at the toolbox. She doesn't apologize. She isn't the kind of person who apologizes easily. But she says quietly to Caldwell, "Leave the box. Leave the man. Leave the building. We're done here." Caldwell starts to object, saying something about legal review and zoning compliance and the logistics hub timeline. Victoria turns to him and says, "Did you hear my father's voice? Because I did, and he wasn't asking me, he was telling me." The security officers leave first, moving toward the door with the particular speed of men who have been relieved of a duty they didn't want to perform. Caldwell follows them, still holding his tablet, still scrolling through documents that no longer matter. Victoria pauses at the door and looks back at Elias. She doesn't say anything. She nods once, the way her father used to nod when he approved of something without needing to say so, and she walks out. The door closes. Elias stands in the workshop with his daughter. Maddie crosses the room and puts her drawing on top of the toolbox, the purple crayon words facing up. Elias sits down on his work stool and looks at the contract still in his hand. He doesn't smile or celebrate. He simply puts the paper back in the folder, puts the folder back in the desk drawer, and listens to the boiler tick as it cools. 2 weeks later, a courier delivers a thick envelope with a return address from the Whitfield Properties Legal Department. Inside is a registered copy of the original contract, notarized and filed with the county clerk, with a handwritten note from Victoria Whitfield that reads, "My father was right about you. He was right about me too. I'm still learning which one matters more." Elias reads it and puts it in the drawer with the cassette. Then he goes back to work. The workshop lights hum at 5:15 the next morning, the same as they always have. Some things don't need to be said because they only need to be done. If you believe that quiet work is its own kind of contract, subscribe. This channel is for the people who keep things running when no one is watching.